Nicholas Markell studied art at an early age. He grew up in Owatonna, Minnesota. He earned a Bachelor of Visual Arts degree at the University of St. Thomas and St. Paul. He was drawn to religious topics and themes, and his artistic pursuits engaged him in many different subjects in a wide array of style and forms. He had religious yearnings as well, studied for a while with the Missionary Society of St. Paul, the Paulists, earning a Master of Arts degree in theology and a Master of Divinity degree from the Washington Theological Union. But he decided to devote himself totally to art. He has worked in glass, pigment, and graphics. He conveys a deep understanding of religious thought in his work and consultation. He has received many, many awards, too numerous to list, for his artistic works. His works have contributed to the art and architecture of many churches, most notably St. Mark's Episcopal Cathedral in Minneapolis, the Cathedral of Mary of the Assumption in Saginaw, Michigan, and St. Thomas More Chapel at Ohio State University. Nicholas has won 7 state habitat competitions. Interestingly, the 2018 Minnesota Wild Turkey Stamp Contest, sponsored by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, a venture which combined his interest in art with his avocation as an angler and a naturalist. Nicholas Markell is now a master iconographer. He has studied in Byzantine and Romanesque traditions. He instructs students and lectures on the sacred art of Christian iconography, leading seminars and workshops nationwide. He has established the Markell Studio with the practice and visionary goal of serving the church community throughout the creation and promotion of iconic imagery. Through his art, Nicholas Markell invites us to contemplate the deeper and more significant aspects of our everyday lives of faith, and so help us shape our future. Please welcome Nicholas Markell.
Can everybody hear me okay? Is that on? Okay, great. Thank you, Father. I belong to St. Mary's in Stillwater, St. Mary's St. Michael's. Father was pastor there for many years and still here today. Wonderful news about his work there, not only leading as the priest there, but as a father figure. I hear from many of the parishioners there today still about his efforts there. And you're very blessed to have Jay as well as your musician, and who's got an incredible eye for atmosphere and the arts, everything from the meticulous small things to the large things. So you're very blessed to have him here. It's kind of interesting to have in my bio that little bit about the turkey stamp. The reason I do that in part is because, as was mentioned, I enjoy it. It's an avocation, but believe it or not, all the details involved in those competitions are relaxing to me, because most of my work, nobody cares how many feathers are on the wing of an angel, but they count the number of feathers on a turkey. And if you don't have them right, you don't win. So it's an interesting thing for me. So I won't give too much about my background because of the time frame today. We have about an hour or so, and I want to get into more of the substantive ideas. I also have a little bit of a cold, so bear with me if my voice gives way. But I'll divide it up into groups. I want to touch a little bit upon what Father Jonkas talked about in his first talk, just to kind of dovetail that with my presentation today. My focus is primarily on the art of the church in the last 50 years. I will touch upon some other aspects such as architecture or things of that sort, but I want to focus it more on the art. And when I say art, I'm also going to include the visual things, not only paintings and that sort of thing, icons or stained glass, but those things that are visual, because I think that comes into play when you're dealing with what the council said and what the revisions of the liturgy have been for the past 50 years. So sacred art, where we have been, and where we are going. My perspective is going to be based on a few things. I was in the seminary with the Paulists for 6 years. As Father mentioned, I have that background behind me. It's a religious community of men, priests that were missionaries. And so I have that formation. But I also have been a liturgical artist and iconographer for well over 30. So I kind of come from a background which is a little bit academic, but primarily practical, primarily dealing with the reality of churches, where they're at, what they're asking for on a day-to-day level. So my work every day is to try to bring that expertise or that experience or that knowledge to the needs of given parishes and what they've been going through and their renovations and building and so forth. And then lastly, a lot of my work that I've been done here at St. John's. I've been involved with various projects here since 2000 or so a good part of your history. And so that's also something I bring to the perspective I have for today. Vatican II, Father Jonkas talked about aspects of that in his first talk, if you were here for it. I break it up into 2 points for our talk today. One was aggiornamento, which was an effort on the part of the Council to bring the Church up to date, and then risorgimento, which was to go back to the original sources. So it did two things. One was to go back and say, what were we? Where did we come from? What was the life of the early church? And how can that influence where we're going? And so as we go through the talk today, keep that in mind about really what the Council did in a big picture. Father Jonkas spoke about a few things I want to just reiterate to dovetail, again, my talk with his. He talked about how St. John's shared, when it was built and designed, many of the same qualities that early churches did. For example, it had a plain facade, or a more plain facade than not, a lot of natural light coming into the building, and he used some examples of early churches that did that. And also it built upon a secular style. The basilica, which is the historic kind of design many churches were built on for centuries, was really a secular structure that was distinct from the temples of the Roman area or other areas in the world. And so in many ways, what the building of St. John's was to echo some of those same qualities. Now, I know for many people, many of the churches built around the time of the Council was quite a break. I was talking to some people here gathered after 11 o'clock Mass, or the 10:30 Mass, for the dining afterward, and they still have the memories of what a shock that was for many of them right after the Council. I'll talk a little bit about that. But to be fair and balanced, I think he did expound upon the reality that, in fact, many of those same qualities that were part of the early church were embodied in the thoughts and ideas behind many of the new churches, including your own. The Vatican II, the church was open to new styles. He spoke a little bit about that. And the focus was on the main elements of the Mass, to try to simplify things, to eliminate all the extra things that had gotten into the liturgy, into the Mass over the centuries, that were not the focus anymore, to simplify it, bring it back to a focus, and that the focus was on full participation of the liturgy, of the laity. And so the church is being designed in order for that to take place. Now, there's many more aspects, but these are the basic ones I want to focus on, because I think they have the most impact for people in terms of how they perceive what happened, their experiences, and where we're going. I will also say that built into his thoughts were the idea that the renewal continues. And he mentioned many of the different things, which I'll comment on later, that have been added or tweaked or developed within the life of your church here in the building. Were very much part of the spirit of the Council, which was, this was the beginning of something new. It wasn't like the end. And so you have been participated in the last 50 years in the continuation of the implementation of the Council's vision, along with many subsequent proclamations from Rome and other documents and things that I'll touch upon. So post-Vatican II churches, what happened? Well, a lot happened, but we have an hour. So I'm going to focus on four things that I want to explore briefly, but I hopefully have some potency to them, that I think have an impact that you can ponder and think about more in the time ahead. The first is that what was the United States like in the 60s? It was a very turbulent time, and I'll get more into this in a second. The second point will be, what were the modern movements in art and architecture? And I put modern in quotes because modern, in the world of art and art movements, modern goes back probably into the 1800s, when some of the more radical shifts started to happen in the world of art. And so what happened at the council in many ways was when the church opened up itself to different styles and forms, it wasn't as though these forms hadn't been around for a while or existed, but it was almost though it was finally ready to incorporate them, or finally there was a door open for these to become part of the life of the church and not only the secular world. The third would be the ecumenical movement, that there was a great desire to find what we had in common with other church traditions, and then the flexibility that was there for the implementation of that vision. Again, so the U.S. in the 60s. So I like to think that, the reforms of the Vatican Council were implemented differently in the U.S. than they were in, say, Africa or Poland. And so we were at a very turbulent time in the 60s. A lot of wonderful things happening, a lot of things that, we've adjusted out of. But it's very important to keep that in mind because, as I was mentioning to some people at the dining here, is that the modern art, the focus of modern art had shifted from Paris to New York City in about the 40s and 50s. And so some of the more modern, in the sense of 40s and 50s kind of movements in art that influenced the church were an American thing, and very much a part of who we believed we were as Americans and so forth. So I think it's very important that when we think about the council and its words and expressions, we made them our own by having an American perspective on things. And then also I think it's, things you probably thought of yourself in part. In the 40s and 50s, or up till that time, Catholics and Catholic kind of spirituality and Catholic identity and the Mass and so forth was a little bit more insular. There was a sense after the election of Kennedy as president that Catholics came more into their own. I mean, there's historians that can go into this at more depth. But there's a sense in which we were maybe moving into the mainstream more, desiring to find more in common with the culture, being more open to other traditions and so forth. So there were many, many things going on in terms of the council, which was from 62 to 65, so right in the middle of all this. So imagine how that is different than would have been in Africa or Poland or some other countries where their culture was such that they would have implemented the documents and the vision differently. So modern movements in art. So I'm going to explore just briefly 3 modern movements in art, and I'll show you the influence they have. The first was Cubism. If you have any background in art, you would know this, but probably the most famous name associated with Cubism is Pablo Picasso. And what he did was to take forms and break them down into geometric elements. And you can see here 2 expressions of that. And there was also Georges Braque, who was another cubist. You can see that the angularization of things, seeing things through different planes and experiences, this has had a huge impact on modern art, is the movement of Cubism. The one on the left there is Pablo Picasso. And here's just some influence that Cubism had on some of the art that you saw within the churches, Catholic churches, from, say, well, even before the council, but again, the council opened the door in a new way from the 40s on. It's particularly the one here on your left. You see how everything is kind of broken down into angular shapes, different perspectives, different planes. Cubism focused on the idea of seeing things multiple perspectives at one time, a silhouette of a face and a face straight on. Some people believe, and I'll talk more about iconography later, some people believed he kind of was trying to recover some of the dimensions that iconography in the church had done for centuries, The idea of showing two perspectives at one time, for example, which icons do well because an icon is outside of time. But one of the criticisms of his work from ecclesial perspective is that rather than representing reformed humanity, he oftentimes represented deformed humanity. And if you look upon the figures and the faces of some of this work, let's go back, you'll see just what I mean. Look at the face down in the corner. He also was very influenced by tribal masks and other things, going back to primitive cultures, rituals, and so forth. So whereas the influence had its power and it has a place, I think that there was a genuine critique that needed to happen that didn't happen for many years in terms of influence in the life of the church. In other words, how can you take the best from the culture and what's going on, but the church also needs to come in and have a voice in terms of understanding just what that best is and leave the rest behind. But still very influential. Here's some other influential movements or images in the church that came from Cubism. Notice the one on the right there, much more naturalistic, a very pleasant image, but very angular. See the cubist kind of dimension that's still influential? You would not have had an image like that done in, say, the 14th century or the 16th century. You might have had a saint, such as this, or a holy figure or so forth, but they wouldn't have been rendered quite this way because they were influenced very much by what was going on in the culture. People know what this one is? Touchdown Jesus. This is at the University of Notre Dame. This was done in '63, I think. This is on the Hesburgh Library facade. I believe it cost about $200,000 back in '63. You can all calculate what that would be today. It happens to be such that when you're in the stadium, you see it up there. So it's called the Word of Life mosaic or a mural, but it's called Touchdown Jesus, and you can figure out why that would be. Okay. But you see the Cubist influence here of these angles, perspectives, the lines. Very important in terms of understanding modern design. Cubism was very influential in terms of understanding design. Okay. Expressionism is another movement that was going on prior to and through. Expressionism, just basically summed up, would be to say communicating one's feelings or emotions through art, right? To express. Again, a new phenomenon. It's not that artists until this time didn't have feelings or they didn't come through in some of their work, but it was not a focal point. What a lot of modern art movements did was to almost take one section or one segment of the bigger picture of art and really focus on it and try to explore and open up what is that idea of just shapes, such as Cubism, or what's the idea of just feelings in art, Expressionism. That oftentimes manifested itself with quote-unquote unnatural colors, such as in the face here, to get an idea of maybe jealousy. I was green with envy, you get that term, remember, or something. And so these ideas start coming through. Note here within these two stained glass windows, some influence, I would say, on Expressionism, particularly this one. This is St. Cyril's in Houston. Notice in the face you have a variety of different colors. It's a stained glass design. But you have this influencing the arts, and you've probably seen churches around in which this is very much at play. The artist is using these ideas. They may not even be fully aware of what they're doing. They're just absorbing the culture, the ideas in the culture, perhaps their own art education, their own training or formation into these ideas. And the last would be abstraction. This is a very large category. There's all kinds of blank abstractions. And I want to make one important distinction because I'm going to talk about iconography later. Some would say that iconography, traditional iconography, such as this triptych, is abstract. But they say it in a different way. Abstraction in the traditional sense means to take something and reduce it to its primary elements, but not confuse it. A good example of that would be if you have done a term paper or a thesis paper. At the very beginning of that paper, you have what's called an abstraction or an abstract. And what that is a paragraph or two which sums up the entire paper in a way that you get right at the heart of the paper with like that. Okay, that's the traditional understanding of abstract. And so it has its place. But I would say that much modern abstraction doesn't necessarily have a paragraph which lets you know exactly what the whole paper is about. It can be wonderful, and I'll show you examples of that. But again, it's part of this larger picture about what do we want to take that's good, and then what do we want to then be able to analyze and critique in terms of how we want to use it. Here's an image by Pierre Mondrian, who is focused on geometric shapes, primary colors. If you go to any modern gallery around the world, we have some great examples here in Minneapolis of his work. Mark Rothko, who dealt purely with color, purely with the impact of color and its effect upon viewers. Other ones would be Kandinsky, Russian, who dealt with abstraction in the sense of shapes and their relationships. Wilhelm de Kooning, who was from, I think, Dutch. I did some of my work in my undergrad work on his work. He begins moving more in the direction of what we might think of as modern abstraction today. Okay. I think some of the greatest influences in abstract have come into the church through banners and abstract stained glass design. I would say you have in here in the back kind of an abstract image, which creates mood and adds color in, I think, a very effective way. Those are the, I think, really wonderful qualities that the idea of the abstract movement brought to the church, was the idea to create mood, to create setting, to see the beauty of the flow of things. It's somewhat similar, perhaps, to an instrumental piece in music versus a hymn. One has words associated with it. It more specifically gets at ideas and concepts, even theological expressions, whereas an instrumental piece sets more of a mood. Maybe it's a mood of peacefulness. Maybe it's a mood of excitement. Maybe it's a mood of triumph. Maybe it's a mood of sorrow. And so what the church has done, again, was able to bring some of that in and make it its own, and I think there's good news in that. So these are a couple examples here of how that was done. Whoops. Ecumenical awareness. Again, I come from a bit of a bias because I was with the Paulists. One of the main focuses of their work, they were evangelists, ecumenists, and reconcilers. That was the main thing. So I was formed in the seminary to think ecumenically, and a lot of the work I do today is with other Christian churches. And so the focus I have in large part is to try to focus on what we have in common. Certainly there are distinctions, but what is it we have in common? And that was certainly the case after the council. There was a desire to go forth into the world to find what you had in common with brothers and sisters in Christ of other traditions. The council had representatives from the East. It had many representatives from the Protestant churches. This was something quite different from councils before. In 69 or so, the new Mass was implemented. That was by Paul VI. So when the council closed in 65, what was still in place at the time was the revised Trinity Mass of John the 23rd. It was really the vision of Paul VI, the movement of the Spirit in the church, to say how do we implement the ideas of the council, and that manifested itself in the new Mass. Now we're in the third phase or revision of that Mass, which is what most parishes experience around the world. The focus, again, on what's commonality. The four elements of liturgy that are common to almost every Christian tradition. We gather, we listen to the word, the story, we eat, and we go forth. So there was a focus, certainly in my formation and in terms of understanding what kind of churches you build and then what kind of art you put in those churches around this fundamental movement of the liturgy that is common to Christians. To gather together, that's why gathering spaces were built or desired, so that when you come together, you recognize yourself early on as the body of Christ. You listen to the word proclaimed. You listen to the story of the church, the story of the community, and the story of the priest preaching. And it's in that story that you deepen or open yourselves up to receive the word made flesh in the Eucharist, or in communion, or in the Lord's Supper, and then you go forth to be that in the world and to change the world, and then you do that again. And it's the cycle of the Catholic life, it's the cycle of the Christian life in general, those churches that worship in that ritual way. When I was in the seminary, we were taught that the feast of the heavenly banquet was what the Mass was now called, and that was this union of the sacrifice of the altar with the fellowship meal at the table. And if you think about what you experience in terms of the Eucharist in the new Mass, that's very much a combination of those two. It has an altar sacrifice dimension, both in ritual and in word and in practice. It has a fellowship meal dimension, both in ritual, word, and practice. And then the flexibility of the implementation of the words of the Council. This, I think, is probably the most impactful when it comes to liturgical art. And that was that many churches were built after the Council with no images at all. It was not only partly based upon the ideas of architecture at the time, which probably didn't think so much in terms of the physical form particularly. That's also true with modern art. It moved so far away from that, you got into abstraction, that the physical form, which we associate with images of saints, of the Lord Jesus, of his mother, so forth, these were not things that came to mind right away when you're thinking of modern architecture. They were built with no spaces for those, oftentimes. The main image was the ritual itself. The main image, or art, if you will. If you think of the body of the people of God, the Christian fellow, gathered together, they're the art of God. They're God's creation. And it's in that image of ritual itself that we partake in the real image of the liturgy itself, okay? That was one of the ideas floating around. That the people are the color. The people are the image. Now, there's wonderful aspects to that, because in fact, the Council focused on the idea that the church was the people, not the building. But I'll talk more about how, even though that theoretically is a good idea, how that might be missing something in practical ways. There was also a distinction in anew made between liturgical images and devotional images. Okay, what was appropriate for the liturgy and what would be appropriate for devotion. And there's always a gray area there. The Stations of the Cross, for example, that are within almost every Catholic church, they're really more devotional images. They come from a devotional practice. They are liturgical in that they speak to the Paschal Mystery, which is liturgical, but still nonetheless, they tend to be more on the devotional side, and yet they're still within the liturgical space, if you will, of most churches. And there was a flood of creativity and experimentation that happened at this time too. Again, because so much was happening. When I was graduated from divinity school, our speaker was Virgil Michael, who was a monk at St. John's in Collegeville, and he was responsible for much of the early liturgical movement that went on there, and he was responsible for much of what eventually the Vatican Council accepted and embraced, so forth. And he said this, and to me it kind of summed it up in a certain way. He said the reason there was so much change in the first years after the Council was because there was so little change the prior 400 years before the Council. And that was his perspective on it, which I thought was, whether you agree with it fully or not, was pretty enlightening. I think people did experience a radical change from the lay position in so many ways after the Council. But in part, I think in retrospect, we can say maybe it is because so little had happened prior for various reasons, many of which are quite understandable, but nonetheless real. So that's one perspective that you can take on things too. Okay, so the Council closes in 65. 69, you have the new Mass. About 10 years later, not quite, you have a book comes out that is a guide for building and renovating churches from the bishop's office called Environment and Art in Catholic Worship. And I'm just focusing here on the United States. And this book for about 20 years was looked to as a guide for building and renovating churches. And these are, I think the left, the brown was the first, or maybe it's just different publishers or something. But it was a very brief document, and it really called for a simplification of things. I won't get into all the details. very modern in its approach to how churches should be built, etc. But there's still some controversy today about its authenticity or its authority in the church, different things. Did it go far enough? We'll find out later. The bishops thought it didn't. But it did call for some very good things which were already implemented here at St. John's even prior to it, which was more authentic materials. You have brick, you have stone, you have wood, you have some quality materials. Because the first 10 years or so, there was a lot of experimenting. We had, felt, polyester, formica. There were a lot of materials you probably aren't going to find as much anymore. It's more of a time period thing, somewhat trendy perhaps. Many of the songs that were sung, in the late 60s, early 70s are not sung anymore. Things come and go. And so, again, re-echoing Father Jacques' ideas that, the evolving continues. And some things we let go of, some things we hold on to. And so this was a start, and for about 20 years or so, this was the document used for building churches. The idea that a lot of churches were built in a more modern form, I think it was also a very practical thing. I really don't think there were many architects trained in anything but that at the time. I think it would be very hard-pressed in, say, 1975 to find an architect who was expert in traditional architecture. You just wouldn't have found it. And so I think that many of the churches are the product of just all kinds of factors that go into what's going on at the time. I want to point out a term you'll probably hear a lot of: noble simplicity. This was one of the terms that came from the council. And I say this in reference to where we've been and where we're going. Here you have, on the left, St. Ignatius Church in Rome, a Baroque church, and then you have Jubilee Church in Rome. This was built right around the close of the council. I think today there's the sense that noble simplicity doesn't necessarily mean it's austere or stark, right? I've been to Rome several times, fortunately, and if you go to a church in Rome, every square inch of the church has some decorative element in it. It's just filled, like this example. Now, to be simple from that doesn't mean to be austere necessarily. And I'll talk a little bit more about how I think what you've done over the last 50 years here has helped to kind of fill out, I think, parts of this space in a way which brings it still into a noble simplicity, but one that also echoes more of the values that the ongoing renewal is calling out of the various parishes. I think there's a beauty to both of these, but I will say, in terms of the idea of focusing on the main elements, you get the idea why churches were built more simply, because you can easily get caught up in a lot of other art that's going on in the church and be so caught up in the church that you may not at all have any sense at all what's going on at the altar table. So I get that, and I think most people do. On the other hand, again, there's a difference between being noble and simple and being austere or primitive or even harsh at times. And so I think we're learning some lessons over the years on that. In '85, the Catechism came out. Again, so you move from the papacy of Paul VI, who's implementing the council, implementing the visions of the council, the new mass, etc. Then we have John Paul II elected in '78. So into his papacy, you can characterize his papacy in many ways, but certainly kind of, pulling things together a little bit more. Maybe he has a more philosophical approach to things, his writings, etc., clarifying some moral issues, things of that sort. But also promulgating and being part of promulgating the new catechism, which was to once again articulate what the church taught. And for me as an iconographer, one of the things that struck me, this came out right around the time I was in the seminary, was the passage in 1160 of the Catechism that Christian iconography expresses in images the same gospel message that Scripture communicates by words, that image and word illuminate each other. This was partly an expression to the Eastern churches, because he, of course, himself was the Pope of the Latin Church and the whole Catholic Church, but in an Eastern country, Poland. He was well aware of the place that iconography had in the Eastern churches, the Orthodox and the Eastern Catholic churches. And this was the first time in a catechism of this sort that Scripture and icon were put on the same level. And so that, to me anyway, personally, was quite an insightful thing to do, to give this form of art, this particular expression of art, iconography, this place within the life of the church. And that, along with many other things, inspired me in my particular calling and many artists in terms of where the church was in the 80s and where was it going with some of the art that was going on. Now in 2000, that first document I showed you about art and environment that was done in 78, in 2000 it was redone, and this document replaced it. Part of the reason was that there were many good things it kept. Again, it focused on some fundamental things that were important in terms of the liturgy. But like any movement, it needs to kind of make its own. It needs to be formed and shaped. And, the bugs need to be worked out, right? And so what this document did was several things beyond it, but I think we'll focus on a few. It addressed the issue of the placement of the tabernacle, and let that be at the discretion of the bishop, but also the desire for this to be a much more important issue in the lives of the people. I think there was this general sense that perhaps bishops were concerned, priests were concerned, that by having the tabernacle not be visible during the liturgy, that there was something missing in that it wasn't quite accomplishing maybe what the thought of having a tabernacle in a separate location. The idea was a good one, and I think there's still people that argue for that. But nonetheless, that was at play. This was given more flexibility in terms of what parishes could do. The other was a crucifix, that in the earlier document talked about the cross, but not necessarily the crucifix. So the crucifix would be a cross with a corpus. And it spoke about the requirement that there be a cross with an image of the Lord crucified. So again, from an art perspective, this was big, and I deal with this almost every day in my work in some way or another, because the cross still remains, in many parishes, the only image they have, which is not what the council said at all. The council, allowed for all kinds of other images. In fact, I encourage other forms of art than the crucifix in churches. But one of the things that it dealt with was that many parishes, because the cross was required, then you had the idea of simplicity, so the cross was seen as the only thing you can have. So the cross artists tried to express every theological idea possible in the cross. A little bit of the crucifixion, a little bit of the ascension, a little bit of the resurrection. So you had all kinds of interesting forms coming out of there. The most common one was the resurrected Jesus on the cross. But again, we moved through a phase with that where now we're moving back to, generally speaking, the projects I'm involved in is a desire to go back to a crucifix. And so the idea there comes through in this document that whatever else you have, that's required. I won't get into details of how that's required. You don't need a large image up, but nonetheless, you do need a crucifix. And then the other would be to encourage, once again, images of Mary, the saints, and the angels, which had kind of been put on the back burner for a long time. One thing I like to say in terms of my work is if people leave St. John's, for example, okay, say you leave here, and someone asks you going out, who are you just with at Mass? Who are you just with? The goal would be, I was with the local community gathered and the saints and the angels. Because that's who you really were with, right? That's what the liturgy says. That's the reality of what's going on. That's the fullness of the depth of the Mass. And so part of the reason for the idea, once again, having images of saints and angels and the Mother of God is to reclaim a fuller idea of what's really going on here. If art is to do anything, liturgical art, it's to help us go deeper into the mystery that is not seeable in the liturgy. And so that's partly what iconography does at its best, is to help us enter into a much more deeper, fuller understanding of what's going on. So let me explore now. Let me just check the time. All right, so we have about 20 minutes. So this last part, I'm going to explore primarily the work here and interweave this with some other ideas to get a sense of things. So here's a picture of the original altar. I think Father Joncas also had some of these, but I want to expound upon different angles or different perspective. And here you have the new piece. Now, the mensa, the top of the altar was used elsewhere. Is that right, Jay? Is that correct? It's the altar top was reallocated. In the entryway, right. One of the things that's valuable in terms of this renewal, and I think St. John's has done this exquisitely well, is things that are being, not of use anymore in the same way or part of the renewal, have been used well, have been honored and respected. And that wasn't always the case after the council. There was an example when I was with the Paulists. The Paulists were in New York City. And one of the movements at that time was to rid the church of opulency, of all the gold and all the richness and all the, the dangling jewels and all that, and the bishops with the gloves and so forth. And so one of the desires was to give all this away, right? That part of the renewal was to become a humble, simple people. For a while, we had chalices that were made of pottery, at the humble Jesus of Nazareth and so forth. So what they did was they took the vestments and brought them down to Goodwill. And so they would see the people that would go in there, sometimes homeless people, walking the streets with the purple brocade vestments from the liturgy. And the point simply was, there was a really great idea behind doing that, but we found out maybe ways to do it better, about how do you become simpler and how do you, feed the hungry and so forth. That was just an image of how something was still amiss. We hadn't quite worked out the nitty-gritty of how to get to that idea. Maybe bringing the brocade down to Goodwill wasn't the way to do it. And so part of the desire, I think, and the good part of the ongoing renewal is if you're going to change something or move it, do it well, do it respectfully, do it honorably. As they say, tradition is giving a vote to the dead. We honor the tradition by saying those who've gone before us still get a vote. They still get something to say about where we're going, and the church does honor tradition in that sense. So here you have the original cross on top. Interesting point with this cross, and this was pretty common in churches. This was part of a movement, partly a Minnesota movement architecturally at about the time of the council closing, which was to not use the Latin cross very much. The Latin cross would be a cross that had a longer base, okay? That would be the Good Friday cross. And the reason thought was that associates you associate yourself specifically with Good Friday. Versus the Greek cross, which is an even cross, which is much more abstract and much more like an association of the church. You get a sense of church, not necessarily of Good Friday so much. So if you look at a lot of modern churches, particularly those that came out right after the council, if they're going to have a cross at all, oftentimes it's a Greek cross. It's an idea of church rather than anything more specific, and you find that here. I personally like the Greek cross for a lot of reasons, and I think this is well done. People don't notice it as much. It's a little bit smaller in terms of proportionally, like the altar table was. And I talked to Jay a little bit, too, about this. Subsequently, a cross was donated or placed in front. There's a whole story behind that. But I think that assists people understanding it's a church more, even if it's not on the top. At least me, as a person coming in from the outside, when I come close to the building, it's easier to associate it as a church because of a cross like that. I'm less likely to see this one, although it's good that it's there. So that was one, I think, addition that addressed a need that the architect, had ideas about. But as you live in a building long enough, it's kind of like going in a new home, right? The walls are empty, and over time you start adding photos of the family and artwork of special people that you know, and the kids' artwork on the refrigerator and so forth. You start making it your own, and you start living in it. Then the house becomes a home, and I think that's what's happened to St. John's in many ways. The house is becoming more of a home, is how I see it. Here you have this canopy that was over where the tabernacle had been, in a place of reservation. So when the decision was made to relocate the tabernacle, just recently, that canopy, which had been in storage, now is placed over the baptismal font. And there's some other photos in here as well of just the way in which it like adds another octave to the keyboard, right? You can do more now. The liturgy can sing more now. The experience of the mystery of baptism with the candles and the lights and things that are part of that can now have a chance for you to have something to see that helps you understand that mystery in a deeper way, and it's reusing something that was originally here, and so it's honoring the architect. So I think that was done really quite nicely. And even a little red color, some color we talked about, what could be done with that, I think that's effective as well in terms of baptism and the Spirit coming down from above. And notice how that's done with lighting. So again, not only just the major art like glass, paintings, murals, but the smaller things that all add up to, again, making the house a home. One of the dynamics that occurred after the council was a shift from the idea of the church being the house of God to the church being the house of the people of God. I think the general sense now is the great Catholic paradox. It's both. It's both the house of God and the house of the people of God. And that keeps in tension the creative mystery of really the fullness of what is going on here. And I think that makes a lot of sense, and it seems to be a good movement, which is being, I think, expressed here. Now notice, I use this with noble simplicity, because look at what's been added over the years here that I really think helps. It's still very simple and noble. So there's some flexibility within what noble simplicity means that we can go into deeper, and it's still being noble, and it's still being simple. But much has been added. And so, again, I think not only for here at St. John's, but for other churches, when you ask, like, where are we going? I think one of the areas churches are going, from my experience and what I read and talking to other people, is, again, making the house a home and also adding or subtracting elements that still keep it within this idea of being noble and simple, but expanding our idea of what simple means. Simple compared to what? And I think that means it doesn't have to be austere and it doesn't have to be primitive. The tabernacle base, interesting story here, was the base we used the base and we cut it apart to form all the other elements. Okay, so now you have back here, the podium back here was actually created from the base the way in which it had to be cut. So this was a little bit challenging because you only have so much stone to work with. And you have to have a really good stone cutter, which we had, I think, in Ken Brooks from St. Paul Fabricating. But we were very mindful in this project, for example, of using what was here in a respectful way, reusing it for something that was needed practically, and help the liturgy to be, again, more of a expanded keyboard in terms of expressing the depth of what goes on at the Mass. So here, for those who aren't familiar, this, before some of the major renovation went up here, this is what it looked like before and after. So to move the chair, to build the canopy, we used the same tabernacle, brought it over with the baldachin. The candles were done in front, again, before and after. So to try to keep everything in the spirit of what was, when I do the consulting work I do, it's very important to me that I believe many of these changes, which are good and needed and a real authentic expression of the people, can be done within the same form and style of the church that was built. You don't have to, go off to a whole other style. It can still be modern, it can still be simple, use the elements you have, rather than bring in a whole other element. I've seen very traditional churches that have been tried to make look modern by, simplifying. Some successful, some not so much, because I think that they're not only trying to simplify it, they're trying to place upon it a style that it was never meant to be. So there's an important kind of dialogue that needs to happen on these issues, and I think here, I think it's really been done nicely. The great doors, I think that's a great addition here. The doors in the life of the church have always had a significant meaning. The doors in Rome, the millennial, the opening of the doors, the closing of the doors. Christ is the doorway. And so I think that was an addition. That's a visual thing. It's not what people think of necessarily as art so much, but in fact, it's architecture, but it's kind of a bridge because it has kind of a setting to it, which makes it almost a work of art, and I think very important for this space. It's almost as though this space had potential here that wasn't fully realized until those doors were installed. And once they're there, there's a sense in which now everything finds a proportionality that is important, that is significant. The atmosphere, I think I was commenting later, I think that the things that were potentially in this architecture are being kind of tweaked out. You know, it's like a child that, you know, you live with for so long, and all of a sudden, you know, I think you have some gifts in this area. Maybe you should try figure skating, or maybe you should try drawing or something. You kind of pull out what you see there as potential. I think a lot of things have been pulled out here that are really nice to see. Little corners now where you can go and find a mystery and meditate that maybe weren't there, but the potential was there. These are the sorts of things that people are looking for that seem to be speaking to the heart of Catholic parishes around the country. Here's another example of how this is treated, where you have the triptych that can close and it can open up again. So there's a book dimension, like an opening of the book. The triptych opens as well. It's the visual word. Iconography is considered the visible word in the church, and therefore it accommodates liturgical seasons well. So one of the things that the council did do well, didn't fully realize at the time, but now in the subsequent years is beginning to realize more, is the way in which you need to be thinking about the liturgy and how the liturgy works in the life of the people, the ritual of the liturgies of the life of the people. What kind of art assists that? It's not just art brought in for any purpose. You know, it's not going to Rome and finding behind the altars a battle scene from the Battle of Pompeii from, you know, whatever century, whatever, where there was a disconnect between the art and the liturgy itself. It's like, what did that event have to do with what we're doing here? Somewhere along the line, there was a disconnect. What the council at large, I think, did was to say, if you're going to have images at all, have them deepen the mystery of what you're doing ritually here, right? And I don't think the numbers and orders are important. I could see a church that had 100 saints. If they're in the right order, that's fine. Now, that would have not been the case back in 1970. You could not have gotten away with that. But, you know, I like to say, if you have 600 people here for a Mass on one Sunday and 700 people the next Sunday, that's room to rejoice, right? It's room to rejoice you have another 100 people here. Well, why not have 100 saints? If they're in the right order, he still has to fulfill the idea of noble simplicity, but the concept isn't foreign. It's the same with the pews. You have how many pews here? I can't even count them. If these were all jumbled up and at different angles, it would be chaos here. The reason you don't even notice them is because they're in the right order. They make a perfect harmony. They're peaceful. They're orderly. So I think much has to do with not necessarily the numbers, but do they support the mystery of the liturgy? And are they in the right order and place? And these are things that artists and architects are starting to revisit, realizing now they have the ability to look into these and consider options that they might not have considered 30 years ago. Devotional areas, a lot of devotional areas. Churches were not built oftentimes after the council with devotional areas so much. The focus was on the liturgy to the extent that devotion, which would be the practice of in the lives of Catholics of extra liturgical things such as the rosary, stations, although they're part of a church usually, devotions to various images or revelations of Mary, or different kinds of things, the Divine Mercy, different types of devotions. There's some new dialogue going on about their place, and I think it's done well here. So the idea would be, when you come in here, the devotions are not distracting you at all for the liturgical celebration, but they're not so distant as you go out that they're not part of your larger experience of being a Catholic. It's not always an easy thing to do, but I think that more parishes are going that direction, and it's at the heart of many Catholics to want the church to once again claim its devotional life and support that in their own life. And then the seasons, which is huge. For me, in terms of my work, and I see this around the country, a lot of churches are not built or weren't built with the idea of seasons in mind so much. How do you accommodate the change of seasons, the different symbols, the different colors? So I think when that is done well, that's a very positive thing, because that is as important for people's everyday experience than some of the other forms of art that they might see. So I would say here are a few things that might be the future. Okay, you've kind of got an idea where we come from, what's influenced things, what had been the focus. I think that as I do work around the diocese, the state, and beyond, These are the sorts of things that come up that are being longed for. A greater sense of mystery within the liturgy, okay? That Vatican II, if you were pre-Vatican II, you may have taken for granted the mystery of the liturgy. Afterward, it became very practical, very functional, very understandable, and younger generations coming up are kind of missing some of that. That's what I'm hearing. They're missing that. You had it, we didn't, we want it, how do we get it? Okay. Warmth, that's another one, especially if the materials are like stone, wood, hard materials, banners, fabrics, color, different things can add warmth. So people are looking, again, for the house to be a home. Beauty, I think this is a beautiful church. But beauty is a very broad category. But beauty has many, many expressions, and a lot of people coming up now, more than before, in art and architecture, are being trained and formed in other philosophies of architecture and art that maybe weren't so much a part of the 60s and 70s, and they're beautiful as well. So I think you're going to find more what might be thought of as historic architectural churches being built based on the ideas of the Renaissance or the Gothic or so forth, that are not necessarily hindered by philosophies of architecture. The church is open to much more than maybe certain philosophies of architecture or art are. And I think you're going to find different expressions of beauty. Reverence, I think the movement of the tabernacle is part of that, this idea of, a reverent space, a place, again, the house of God, as much as the house of the people of God. And then transcendence and the eternal. I was saying that when we built here, this was when Father Murtaugh was pastor. I don't know if you remember this, Jay, we were meeting, one of the comments was when we were designing, was he said, maybe somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it was like, I just want something we don't have to replace in 20 years. And I think the thought was, again, a little bit, but the idea was, many churches, they went through 4 renovations in 40 years. And it's like, I think we can get to something eternal or timeless more quickly. That the bells chimed, so I'm well aware. I'm going to move a little quick here, though. So here's another thought. I think one of the big influences that's going to, I think, influence a lot of art in the Catholic experience is the St. John's Bible. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Bible in 2000, St. John's University commissioned the first handwritten Bible to be created since the Reformation, Protestant Reformation. And in it are illuminations that, for me, if you go through, are a combination of a variety of things. The very best, I think, in some ways. I mean, I don't like all the plates necessarily, but in general, a combination of some of the very best of the influences of modern art, abstraction, expressionism, so forth. But also here you even have an iconographer who it was commissioned to do quite a number of pieces. A very realistic artist that did naturalistic works of butterflies and plants and things. It's very beautiful. So I think this might be in many ways kind of a major project that could spearhead the fact of how we can go forth and integrate some of these ideas in a way that I think works. And so I think the St. John's Bible will be a great part of that as we move forward. And I'll just briefly mention a few things here on iconography. That's really a great focus of what I've been doing is iconography. When you leave, Jay has printed out for you a set of, I think, 12 to 15 inserts that were part of the bulletins when this was created. Over a period of many, many weeks, from Lent to Easter, we rented a scissors lift, and we did each step along the way. So when parishioners came, it was like a mini retreat. They would see the icon unfolding, and they would have a description in the bulletin of where we were in the process and what steps we were doing. Because iconography is very symbolic, very deep. Every step has a purpose. And that's available for you to read and reflect upon if you haven't read it or you're new to the parish, etc. You get an idea from that just about what the focus of my work has been, which is to really recover within the life of the church something much deeper, something much more timeless, something much more spiritual than I had experienced prior. That's been my attraction, and that's why iconography is growing in the life of the church. Just a few things. The Council of Nicaea, this was in the 8th century, said icons are to be kept in churches and honored with the same relative veneration as is shown to other material symbols such as the precious and life-giving cross in the book of the Gospels. So as going back, remember aggiornamento, to go back to the original sources, one of the things artists are doing are going back like myself and finding that we need to do more with the icon in the life of the church, and it's been there from the very beginning. John Paul said to breathe with both lungs, both east and west, and so the influence of the Eastern tradition, I think, has been very influential in the life of parishes. I won't go into a lot of the depth, but Pope Benedict said in a book he wrote while cardinal that the fundamental theology of the icon should be normative for the Church of the West as well as the East. And so that's really been a huge focus of my work with parishes, is to try to regain some of these fundamental ideas. The icon speaks to the intellect of the heart, and it also is a precursor to the beatific vision. Interestingly enough, when the church speaks about heaven, not that we'll hear God, but that we'll see God. It's a visual reality, and there's an opportunity for us to create art that helps us get there better. I had a priest who was very kind enough to purchase a number of my icons over the years when financially I needed the help. You don't make a lot of money as an iconographer, as you can imagine, but I get by, and I thank God for that. And he said, looking at the icons that you have prepares me to see God in heaven. And so that was very helpful for me in terms of my vocation. Icons are not an image of the ideal person, but the transformed person, not an image of improved creation, but of a new creation. And so it helps us, if we're part of a culture that's very much self-help, and you can get better and improve, yes, to a point, but God has greater plans, and that's something completely new through God's grace. Just briefly, the stained glass that we've been doing over the time, again, regaining the idea of the saints' presence with us, the symbols that speak to their life. So one of the things that's happened in the last 50 years has been a resurgence in the life of the saints in the church. Here's one of the Trinity, again, over here. Symbolism, color, life, figurative images, and of the seraphim, which come to us from the book of, from the prophet about in the temple, where's the six-winged fiery angels that forever praise God. And then lastly, as we wind down here, just some photos I pulled from your site in case people haven't seen them about the ritual. So we go back full circle now to the real focus in many ways of the Vatican reform of the liturgy was that the liturgy of the people become the main image. Nothing that's been done, I think, takes away from that, but the very bones of the architecture here still enable that to happen well. And so if you look at some photos of the liturgy here, it's very much a sense of the work of the people. Tall ceilings to allow so much to happen, banners, palms, the way the space works in low light, candle, and then just a triptych to end it. So yes, it's been wonderful to be part of many of the projects here. You have a church that's been through things, but it's got great bones, and it's been warmed up, and it's now, I think, more a house, a home from a house. So wonderful, thank you.